All right, good morning, everyone. If folks could begin to take their seats and give the last hug or handshake. It's so nice to be with so many familiar faces. All right, let's get this party going. So good morning, everyone. I'm happy to welcome both our in-person visitors and those who are tuning in online to New America. I'm Rachel Fishman, and I'm the director of the Higher Education Program. We are a team of researchers, writers, and advocates from diverse backgrounds who shed light on some of the most challenging issues facing higher education today. We are dedicated to making higher education more equitable, more inclusive and accountable so that everybody has an opportunity to obtain an affordable and high quality credential. We are a voice for students in policy discussions that are dominated by institutional, and as we're going to hear today, industry interests. We come together today to lift the veil on enrollment management, to hear how a powerful industry that few know about limits the social mobility of low-income students and students of color. We are proud at New America to help launch this important edited volume on enrollment management. And I hope those in attendance manage to snag some copies and purchase it online for those watching online. I am happy to welcome several chapter authors today to our panels, including Don Hostler, John Marcus, John Oberg, Beth Zasloff, Jerry Lucido, and Kevin Carey. And I thank Zakiya Smith-Ellis, who's going to be moderating our second panel. But who I really want to talk about today is my colleague, Steve Bird. Don't worry, Steve, this is not a roast, it's the opposite. He's the editor for this volume, and he wrote one of the chapters, and he's going to be moderating our first panel today. I want to acknowledge how influential he's been both to the field, but also to me in my career. Over a decade ago now, I was in graduate school. It's like now, I'm rounding generously, it's like more than a decade ago, at Harvard. And this is an institution that thrives on enrollment management, right? And probably knows, has been using enrollment management longer than it's even been called enrollment management. Some of my classmates were admissions professionals, and through conversations and coursework, I learned very quickly that there was something called an enrollment management industry. I remember discussions where students explained how they could figure out things just by the zip code of students, and so they actually weren't need-blind institutions, and it was like a little mustache twirling. So, after I picked my job off the floor, this really struck me as supremely unfair to students, especially because I was there along with some of my other classmates to really make higher education more affordable, more accessible to students that we've seen marginalized in our higher education system. And I felt like I was sharing a classroom space with people who were working in the opposite direction. So after I graduated, I got my first policy job, and I got to work with Steve. Steve and I had some shared interests. We hate things that are terribly unfair. We are passionate about equity and social justice. We really like Kit Kats. And once we get a bee in our bonnet, bzzz, watch out for both of us. He already had a long-established career looking out for the needs of low-income students, calling out industry and institutional interests as he saw it, making real change on behalf of those students. How refreshing it was to have a mentor, an amazing thinker, writer, editor, to bounce ideas off of, to collaborate with, to be edited by. Steve absolutely pushed me and continues to push me on my thinking. He makes me a better policy analyst. He makes my ideas and my passions for students feel welcome and embraced on the team. He's the one who told me that whatever got me fired up, which he calls Rachel's rants, should be an indication of what I should write about and work on. It has resulted in some of my best work, some of the work I've done on financial aid award letters, my work on Parent Plus loans. As you can imagine, he and I have had many collaborations over the years, and I hope we have many more. And a lot of these collaborations have really shed light on the enrollment management industry. I could not be prouder of Steve's contributions to the field. If it weren't for him in many ways, we wouldn't know the things that we know. We wouldn't be here discussing this issue today. And I feel so glad to know Steve is so firmly in the corner of students and in the corner of his colleagues who advocate for a better and more equitable higher education system. Steve has shown us all that we can work together to investigate, to shed light, to to write well and with empathy and determination, and that we can make change. I am so looking forward to this event. I thank the Joyce Foundation, who generously supported Steve's work on this book, and I'm going to turn it over to Samir Gadkari, president of the Institute for College Access and Success, to give some more opening remarks.
Hi, I'm Samir Gadkari. I'm the president of the Institute for College Access and Success, or TICAS. We're a nonprofit, nonpartisan think tank that works on college affordability, accountability, basic needs, completion, with an eye towards restoring and enhancing racial equity and economic mobility in our higher education system, both at the state and federal level. I know that we're all here because we care about making sure that education and the benefits it bestows are available to individuals across our society, regardless of how much family wealth they may come from, regardless of what race or geography they were born into or may be living in. It's because we all care about that it's so important to celebrate Steve's accomplishment in releasing this book, a book which I know he's been thinking about and working on for quite a few years, and an issue on which he, I think, deserves more credit than anyone in the country for keeping a conversation going about the ways that colleges all too often privilege their interests over those of students and leave students behind. This book covers so many of the important topics that we need to figure out as a higher education policy community. The use of merit aid to bestow scarce resources on students, the competitive pursuit of already privileged students in the zero-sum game of college rankings, the opacity of financial aid award letters, an issue which New America has been crusading about for many years, the ways that unaffordable debt, large burdens, often backfilled by loans, are left for the students who simply want to get an education, and some of the troubling revenue maximizing strategies that to date may hoover up a bunch of student data in ways that are very worrisome. Steve has been thinking about this for so many years, and he's educated so many people in the policy community about this. I think we'd both probably feel a little bit older if I really reflected on exactly how long ago Steve and I met. But I appreciate all that he has done to educate me about these issues, to help connect me to the broader community of researchers, policymakers, and thinkers who are trying to figure out how do we build a better higher education system that addresses some of these problems. So before I say anything else, I just want to say congratulations, Steve, on your incredible accomplishment and on this wonderful volume, which everyone who's watching online should go buy right now. I thought it was appropriate to offer a few words about the context that comes up time and again and in which this book is situated. Some of the changes that have happened over decades in the higher education system that have helped build the system that we now need to address. Especially thinking about some of the wealthier institutions that the practices that Steve and his co-authors highlight in this volume. First, there's been, over the past couple of decades, a growing trend towards increasingly national and even international markets for so many of these colleges in terms of the students they pursue. And that's been particularly acute in the upper tier of selectivity. Carolyn Hawksby and others have written so much about these trends and how they've evolved over time. We've seen, too, that wealth inequality has fed philanthropic inequality and has resulted in a growing disparity in the resources across the spectrum of higher education. One of the authors of this book, and a friend to many of us, I know, Cappy Bond-Hill, has written about this, and Charles Klopfelter also kind of documented how this set of trends has played out over many decades. And On top of that, we've seen on the public slice of higher education, and this pertains particularly to some of the flagship universities, the ways that states have used their higher education budgets as a balance wheel, the ways that good and understandable needs around healthcare and other imperatives in state budgets have resulted, particularly during recessions, in funds being taken away from higher education, with colleges and universities left to find as much money as they possibly can to make up the difference, and the resulting ratcheting up of tuition as a share of the revenue in public higher education. These trends have been many decades in the making, but they offer some of the fuel for the fire that this volume talks about. The end result of all of this is a stratified system that all too often reproduces underlying societal inequities and lavishes resources on the students from the most advantaged backgrounds, and leaves the students who come from the least advantaged backgrounds, who come from the least family wealth, bearing a very large burden in the form of loans and debt. It's worth noting that the problems at the top of the higher education ecosystem are quite different from the experiences of the vast majority of students in many ways. And oftentimes in the public policy realm, we focus our efforts on the 75% of students who attend public universities, including the vast majority who are in open access colleges and universities. And in those institutions, we see long-standing inequities by race, in terms of institutions that were chronically underfunded and students who were systemically denied access to higher education, particularly HBCUs and black students. We see longstanding inequities by income, including thousands of dollars of a college affordability gap, even after accounting for a reasonable work expectation. Many decades ago, it might have been reasonable for a student to work their way through college and not have to take out any debt. But now we find that even for a student at a family making, say, $30,000, they need to find the funds, oftentimes backstopped by loans, of $7,000 or $8,000 in a state like New York. And a forthcoming TICA study looks at a dozen states, and we find a gap on that order in nearly all of them. So if you think about it, after asking a student from a family of $30,000 to come up with maybe $9,000 of work earnings, we're still asking for another $7,000 or $8,000 to be able to go to college. That's a really daunting gap if you think about what a share of income that is. And, you know, the merit aid arms race that we're going to be hearing so much about today certainly is a feature of the upper stratum of higher education in many ways. But those behaviors, those problems have started to pervade a share of the public higher education system as well, and are feeding the wide-standing, broad anxiety about college that is increasingly pervasive in our society. If I think back to Caitlin Zaloom's work from a few years ago, it outlines the ways that anxiety is shaping high school experiences for students even from wealthier backgrounds. The worrying questions that we're going to hear about and raise today apply to all kinds of institutions and call for public policy to set some limits around what practices are permissible and how we will work together to ensure opportunity across our society. It's worth noting that these challenges manifest differently in these different sectors. So if I think about tuition-dependent, non-selective private colleges, there's research suggesting that a significant share offered so-called discounts, or aid, depending on your point of view, to 100% of students. So the prices are totally made up, but they can still be daunting for students when they see those high sticker prices. We have public community colleges that have been underfunded and have fewer resources to invest in education and lower graduation rates. We have public non-selective regional colleges that bear the brunt and face, oftentimes create some of the highest affordability gaps that linger as a result of meager investment. And in the wealthiest state universities, we face a question about how much they're able to or ought to, or how they could better support their public mission that they had for many decades, and how we extricate them from the race that we're going to be talking about today. It's also worth noting, and I know many of the people in this room work with us on this, that there are for-profit colleges that create lots of opportunity create little opportunity but lots of debt. And we need to figure out how public policy can address them too. So the path forward, I think, involves multiple problems, multiple types of colleges, multiple markets, and a collision between values and money. that unfortunately in these different sectors reinforce some of the longstanding inequities in our society. No silver bullet will solve all of our problems, but we need to figure out how do we better put limits around student prospecting? How do we create more transparency around aid awards? How do we make sure that in this age of AI and big data, we set appropriate limits on students? How do we make sure that we're thinking about each of those subsectors of higher education and addressing and creating accountability for the institutions that are leaving students worse off, particularly in the for-profit college sector, while investing in the public sector in ways that reduce the affordability gaps? How do we make sure that we reduce the reliance on debt and loans? And how do we get state and federal policymakers pulling in the same direction on affordability and accountability, on basic needs and student debt, pushing together to make sure that we are supporting the public aims of higher education, the public missions of higher education, and supporting the students who need the help the most to achieve their college dreams? I look forward to the discussion today. And once again, I want to thank New America for their longstanding support of shining a light on these problematic practices, on the need for policy solutions, and for carrying that work through so many years, and the singular person of Steve Bird for embodying that mission, that need, and continuing to shine a light on these problematic practices that we see. Thank you so much for joining us today, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thanks for coming, everybody. I feel like it's like my bar mitzvah again. Today we're going to be discussing a very lucrative industry that's played a pivotal role in transforming the way that selective colleges recruit students and award their financial aid. In other words, in determining who gets in and how they pay for it. And there are many things that are remarkable about the enrollment management industry, but perhaps the most is how few people actually know it exists. Under the sway of the enrollment management industry, private consulting firms that devise recruiting strategies for colleges, selective colleges, both public and private, are engaged in an arms race for the students they desire most, typically the best applicants who apply and the wealthiest. As a result, these institutions are leaving less privileged students with fewer seats and larger funding gaps. Instead of removing barriers, they're adding hurdles, making it more difficult for low-income students to go to college and to earn a degree. Private colleges first adopted enrollment management practices and policies in the late 1970s and 1980s. More recently, in the face of state disinvestment and the prospect of rising up the rankings, public universities have embraced enrollment management as well. At the urging of expensive private consultants, these once low-cost institutions, which for decades, generations, served as a gateway for the middle class, are hiking up their prices and using their financial aid to lure affluent out-of-state students to their campuses. In other words, these public universities are becoming bastions of privilege, just like their elite private college counterparts. I believe that higher education is facing a crisis, but policymakers are not going to know how to deal with this crisis without understanding what the real problems are and who is responsible for them. This book seeks to answer those questions by lifting the veil on the enrollment management industry. Written by higher education journalists, researchers, and former college leaders and enrollment managers, the volume is the first to look at enrollment management as the industry. It provides a history of how the industry came to be, identifies the major players, and shows how it has fundamentally changed the ways that colleges recruit students and award financial aid, while operating mostly out of public view. The volume also offers a wide range of possible solutions. It has been such a privilege to work with such an amazing group of people on this book. I've gotten a lot of praise today, but the people who really deserve credit are the various authors who I worked with for a couple of years and who had to endure multiple rounds of editing. And I especially want to thank Harvard Education Press for publishing the book and for really getting behind it, and the Joyce Foundation for helping to finance it. And again, these great chapter authors who devoted so much time and effort to this project. Today, we are lucky to have 6 of those authors here to discuss their chapters. The first panel, which I will be moderating, will provide an introduction and a critique of the enrollment management industry. And the second panel, which my friend Zakiya Smith-Ellis will be moderating, will examine 2 possible solutions for reining in or reorienting the enrollment management industry. So let's get the first panel started. If everybody can come up. Okay, just to get started, I wanted to talk to John Marcus. Actually, what I realized is I don't have biographies of everybody here, but John has been an amazing higher education journalist for a long time. He actually has a book that he's working on, so I can only say that I'm happy that mine is done, and wish him luck. And John, I wanted your chapter, which you really look at the enrollment management industry. It starts with a party. I was going to say, just like The Godfather, it starts with a party. So can you explain the significance of that party? And
Sure. Thanks for having me, and thank you for asking me to write this chapter. I learned a lot. I think a lot of people in this room will sympathize with the reality that as important as it is to write about higher education, it can sometimes be dry to write about yield and discount rates. So I learned about this party at Royal & Company in Richmond to celebrate the 30th anniversary of Royal, which is one of the earlier and more successful enrollment management companies. It had a number of purposes. It was the 30th anniversary of the company. The founder, Bill Royal, was ill with ALS. He would die the next year, so it was sort of a celebration of him. There was also a lot of other things to celebrate. One is that Royal had been sold for $850 million to EAB, which 2 years later was sold to a financial investment fund for $1.5 billion. So it was a good kind of example of what happens in this industry and the value of it.
And those numbers are pretty incredible. Were people surprised to see that the enrollment management industry was worth that much?
Way more than that. So although virtually all of the enrollment management industry is privately held, other than some nonprofits, there's no real reliable way of finding out the scope of it. There are some financials that have been disclosed as part of these transactions, but people on the inside, there was some consensus that we're looking at about a $15 billion a year industry. Now that includes everything from data analytics, predictive analytics, and customer relationship management, or CRM, which companies like Salesforce are getting involved with in the higher ed space, to lead generation and marketing consulting. 90% of colleges in a survey, which happened to be conducted by EAB, said that they use enrollment management. My speculation is the other 10% are either lying or they're about to close.
What would you say are the benefit that these firms bring to colleges, and what have the drawbacks been?
There is universal consensus from universities that the single most important benefit is they are cheaper than if the institutions tried to do this work in-house. Doesn't mean they're cheap, they're extremely expensive. And in public financial disclosures of private nonprofits, for instance, you can see they have to disclose their independent outsourced contractors, independent contractors. They are typically among the highest paid contractors along with the construction companies that are building all the buildings they don't need. This is a significant sized industry. But interestingly, as I know you'll cover, it also includes some large nonprofits like ACT and the College Board, which sell names. ACT has the lovely euphemism, the interest index of names of test takers that they sell. ACT also went on an acquisition spree of a number of small consulting firms because they want to get in the research and consulting business.
So it seems in your chapter that many colleges who work with these firms have misgivings about them. In fact, one called them witch doctors. Can you explain what kind of misgivings they have and why they feel compelled to work with them despite those misgivings?
Well, the misgivings are the ones that I know you'll be devoting most of this morning to, which are the high tuition, high discount model, which is really beginning to tear these institutions down. The new discount rates came out yesterday from NACUBO, 56.1% for freshmen. I have a podcast. We went around to some retail companies and said, what will you give us for 56% off? And you can hear their answers available wherever you get your podcasts. They were not nice answers. This is a crazy model. It doesn't make sense, and they know it. And so university presidents, when asked, talk about how merit aid in particular works against their values, but they also say in similar proportions that they'd be at a competitive disadvantage without it. Another kind of interesting thing that I learned on this, writing this chapter and interviewing a lot of the major players who are fascinating characters, was that some of them have misgivings. And Jack McGuire, who keeps being raised as the father of enrollment management, likes to say, he said to me, I will use the worst word I can think of to describe what's happened to enrollment management, and that word was Trumpian.
One last question for you, John. It doesn't seem like there's been a lot of reporting about these companies. What I'm just amazed at is just how few people really know about them. But why do you think that, why that is, why there hasn't been that much reporting?
Well, there's two answers to that question. I agree that we don't necessarily call out enrollment management companies when we're writing about enrollment management. Because as we were discussing before this panel, it's the colleges that are making the decision to accept this advice. Number one. Number two, we're reassured by the fact that we know you're watching them for us. And number three, where I would differ a little bit on that question is that I think people know what's happening. They might not know that there's an industry behind it. But what's happened, interestingly, during the 2010s is this public awareness of the games that happen in admission that they didn't previously understand. There's more scrutiny of this, there's more coverage of it, there's more understanding of it, and that's leading to this crisis of confidence in higher ed. Another survey that came out earlier this week said that 87% of Americans believe that colleges have only their own self-interest in mind. The only surprise to me about that number was that there are still 13% of people who don't think that.
They work at colleges.
Okay, thank you, John. Next, we have Don Hostler. Don has made a career of following enrollment management. He knew about it way before most people knew about it, and actually served as an enrollment, after studying it, writing the first book about it, became an enrollment manager. So what was that like when you became an enrollment manager? You were at the Indiana University, the flagship campus.
I chaired an unsuccessful search. Oops.
Yeah.
Is this on? Okay. I chaired an unsuccessful search committee. 3 of the candidates turned it down, and the chancellor didn't like the third and asked if I would do it for 1 year, and it turned out to be 8. It was really kind of invigorating to begin with. I mean, my whole interest in this really, I went to what Aston and Lee would call an invisible college, local regional college that almost went out of business because it didn't have enough students. And I remember talking to the admissions director a few times, and I was shocked how frequently they did continue to do things. They weren't sure if it worked, but they weren't sure what worked, so they were reluctant to change anything. And I thought, surely there must be research to illuminate some of these questions. And my first book was really a review of relevant research on what we know about causes students to go to college, what we know about the effects of financial aid, what we know about influences student retention. So at first, I was shocked how well it went. My charge was just to get the entering class, which had slipped to about 5,000, back up to 6,000. And to get out-of-state students back up to 40%, and it slipped down to around 33%. And to show you how unsophisticated, the person handling the non-need-based aid at that time was telling me about this great yield rate they had on accepting financial aid offers, which they didn't send out until May. And my line was, yeah, if you offer someone financial aid who's already coming, they will accept it. Because we know that most students have decided where they're going to go by then. So simply by getting aid offers out earlier, and what I would say, one institution once called this vanity aid, giving out relatively small of amounts of aid to pretty good out-of-state students, not great out-of-state students, that we were able to get the out-of-state numbers back up to where they were, and we were able to get the in-state students back up to where they were. Where I started to have some real issues, I found administration to be a constant dialogue about ethics every day. Every day. And I want to say, some of the critiques I read about enrollment management are silly and naive. There is no such thing as a large organization that doesn't have conflicting goals. The issue is not, do you avoid those goals? The issues are, what are the little decisions you make every day related to those goals and the trade-offs? It's not even the big decisions. It's the little decisions you make every day that ultimately define how you're. So I became concerned after a couple of years. I started asking for some reports on unmet need and discovered moderate income students, not low income students, low income students between federal and state aid. Indiana had a pretty generous state scholarship program. They were being covered. It was the gap of moderate income students. It took me, I don't actually remember, 3 or 4 years before I could get the institution to want to do anything about it. And it actually took a new president. And even then, they didn't want to move any money out of merit aid. What they decided to do was to make the next big giving campaign focused on need-based aid. And that's the way they dealt with it. They were really unwilling to do anything that might affect mostly really that mix of in-state, out-of-state, not so much. If you think about the Iron Triangle, we weren't in pursuit of prestige at that point. A later president was. We were happy with, the chancellor was happy with where he was, and there was actually quite a bit of press on maintaining diversity. For us, the issue was they were unwilling to address the kind of financial inequalities.
Okay, I wanted to just ask you you highlight enrollment management practices in your chapter that bring up ethical concerns. Mm-hmm. I just was wondering if you could highlight some of those here, or maybe like which practices do you find the most troubling?
Oh, most troubling? I've got a great list. I hate Mondo scholarships. Mondo scholarships, big scholarships that usually not only cover need, but have things like money to study abroad and so forth. And institutions usually point to those students at time of graduation and say, look at all the great things they've done. Well, hell, if you look at what they have to do to get those scholarships, they're already doing it. They come from affluent families, they come from lots of advantages, and then, you know, I think it was Alexander Aston, but I've never actually found this quote, so maybe it's me. What the most important thing Harvard does is admit students that they then later take the credit for all their accomplishments. And that's true of a lot of large merit-based scholarship programs. I even have some problems anymore with honors colleges. You know, a lot of honors colleges basically do what selective institutions do. the practices really aren't all that much different. It's hard to get an honors, at least I found at my place, it was hard to get the honors college to begin to look at socioeconomic status and things like that as part of their decision to who to enroll.
Do you want to just say something about financial aid leveraging? Or?
Yeah, and for me, it's really along the continuum. I mean, we have an obligation as administrators in universities to have some sense of how does our financial aid, is our financial aid achieving our objectives from an evaluative point of view? Where it really gets dicey is where consultants aren't looking at gapping. There are some firms now that literally claim they can develop individualized packages that literally 3 students who might look the same on kind of sociodemographic characteristics, but they know behavioral measures from the way the students have interacted with the institution. They come up, each of those 3 students could literally get 3 different financial aid packages. So for me, I want to differentiate between leveraging and tuition discounting. I don't think necessarily that all tuition discounting is bad, but leveraging taken to an extreme is really problematic and unethical.
Okay. I want to get to Beth Zasloff, who is a writer, and she wrote or co-wrote a really amazing book. You have to tell us what the name of that is again.
Hold fast to dreams.
Yes. And your chapter in the book is called Gapping Through College. Can you tell us what financial aid gapping is? 'Cause, Don kind of mentioned it. But.
Yeah. Well, in simple terms, it's when a college does not meet the full financial need of students it admits. A gap is the difference between the college's cost of attendance, which is not only tuition, but also room and board and expenses, and the amount that a family can pay. I think gapping is, of course, to some degree about scarcity. Not many colleges can afford to meet the full need of all the students it admits, but it's also an institutional choice. With a limited pot of financial aid dollars, there's a choice about how many of those dollars go to luring affluent students who will help college rise up in the rankings and who can pay a large enough percentage of the tuition to help the college raise revenue. And that form of aid, whether you call it merit aid or non-need-based aid, is coming from the same pot as the dollars that go to making a college affordable for a low-income student.
Okay, in your chapter, you follow the college journey of Joanne, a first-generation low-income student. Can you tell us a little about Joanne, her family, and how you found her?
Mm-hmm. Joanne is a really wonderful young woman. I don't know if she's watching on the live stream, but if yes, hi, Joanne. And she was generous to share her story for this project. I first met her after she had completed her first year at Ithaca College, and she shared her story about getting there and getting through the first year. Joanne grew up in the Red Hook houses in Red Hook, Brooklyn, a waterfront neighborhood in Brooklyn, home of Brooklyn's largest housing project. Her mom is an immigrant from Haiti. She has a younger brother, William, who I also spoke with for the chapter. Joanne's mom supports the family with a monthly disability check. Let's see, Joanne, in her first year, was studying exercise science and education at Ithaca College. Her goal was to become a physical education teacher, which was inspired by an internship at her New York City public school. Great person, lots of determination, self-described as shy when I first asked her to tell me about herself, but it hasn't exactly come off to me. She's incredibly determined and truth-speaking. Joanne was supported in her college process and through college by an organization called the Red Hook Initiative, which is a Brooklyn community organization that does a lot of work for youth empowerment and community building, and a big part of what they do is around college access and retention. And when I had the assignment of writing about gapping for this book and finding a student story to tell, I approached the Red Hook Initiative, which I knew from previous college access work in Brooklyn, and worked with the organization to meet with students who were willing to share their stories and speak about their experiences with financial aid.
So tell us, Joanne receives a financial aid award letter. So Ithaca is her dream college. She gets the financial aid award letter. You say Ithaca employed a trick to make the school look less expensive. So can you tell us about that and also the difficult choice that she had to make?
So Joanne applied to a bunch of colleges. Projections started coming in. Things were looking, uncertain. She gets into Ithaca, which was her top choice, perfect school for her in so many ways. Then, after acceptance, she needs to study and understand the financial aid letter. Ithaca's cost of attendance at that time was $64,000. I think 40-something, I don't have the number correct in my head, but a certain amount was covered by grant aid or gift aid that she wouldn't need to pay back. The remainder is loans and work study. Sandwiched in between the federal subsidized loan and the work study is Parent Plus loan. A Parent Plus loan is not aid. It is a loan that a parent, not the student, can take out that is a much riskier type of loan than federal subsidized education loans. It's risky for a whole number of reasons that I learned about through New America's work, and really isn't aid. It's not something that the college is offering, and it is.
So they actually packaged it and made it look like it was just regular aid and didn't actually explain basically what it meant. But they were asking Joanne's mom, who, as you said, received a monthly disability check, to take out a $14,000 Parent Plus loan for her to be able to go. Can you just quickly tell us sort of the emotional toll that took on Joanne in her first year of college?
Yeah. Well, it was, of course, an extremely tough decision to move forward, and one that Joanne and her family and her advisors at the Red Hook Initiative did not take lightly, but they decided to move forward for that first year. And as Joanne described her experience of her first year of college, there's really the feeling that gap, that $14,000 is weighing on her. It's very much an ever-present anxiety, worry, also something that provoked a lot of confusion and that she had to kind of work through and think about. She did have help from her advisor from Red Hook Initiative, who she's still in close touch with. The financial aid office did not give her much help, and she said in an interview that on campus it was known that the financial aid office was the nicest and cleanest building on campus because there weren't students in it. And so she had this feeling that she was kind of, in this beautiful place with plenty of opportunity, but that she had this kind of invisible weight of
She also
debt.
saw, there's a great scene where she saw a friend who was going to the financial aid office, and what did the friend say?
Yeah, so she's leaving her dorm with a friend who makes a kind of offhand comment to her, oh, I have to go to the financial aid office because they're giving me $14,000 that I really don't need. And Joanne describes hearing that as kind of a punch in the gut. I mean, coincidence or not coincidence that that's the same amount of her gap that is causing her so much pain. And she's been told, oh, you know, the college doesn't have enough money, we're doing what we can for you, and then she's hearing her friend say this to her. So it really, I mean, talk about lifting the veil. It's
I think that Beth's chapter is really great. I really recommend it. It really shows the emotional toll this took when people are gapped that much. John Oberg. There's so much I could say about John Oberg, but he has been a true mentor of mine. Most famously, he worked in the education department under the Clinton administration, and he became a major whistleblower who got money back from student loan companies that were overcharging the government. We don't want to go into that, because that could be a whole nother session. But John, if you were advising Secretary Cardona, as you've advised Richard Riley during the Clinton administration, what steps would you urge him to take to make sure that colleges aren't undermining the federal student aid programs? I mean, you're pretty critical on enrollment management, and what do you think needs to be done?
Thanks, Steve. Pretty critical is an understatement. I am angry. I am infuriated. When you read this book, all the chapters, I hope that's your reaction too. I would like to say, before I go on and on, and Steve may want to cut me off on some of my answer here, to recognize his great work on this book. It has just been tremendous. Steve, you said it took a couple years. As I recall, it was about 3 or 4 years that I wrote my chapter.
Let's not
and
talk
I
about
don't think
that.
I would change a word of it. And I am honored to be here with this group of panelists and authors. And I also want to say, too, I don't know if this is a friendly or an unfriendly audience. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, I don't know. But I know there are some friendly people here, and I'd like to single out, of course, TICAS, which has done remarkable work over the years. I was there at the creation. I'd also like to single out New America, not just Steve, but Rachel, and her wonderful work over the years on Parent Plus loans. And we could also say a lot about some other people. I don't know if they're represented here, but the Century Foundation and its work on Parent Plus, and Brookings Institution, its work on algorithms that are being used in enrollment management, and many others. And here on the panel, I've been reading Don Hostler for years, and I always look forward to it, and John Marcus with that wonderful Hechinger report always has new truths in it. And when I read the book, I do get angry, but I also learn a lot. Wow, is there a lot of information in this book? And if you don't come away angry as well and charged up about, let's do something about this, you haven't read the book very carefully. Steve, to try to answer your question, that is to say, if I were advising the Secretary of Education about what steps ought to be in order right now, yes, I worked under 3 secretaries, Secretary Riley and Page and Spellings. My advice wasn't taken very much by Secretary Page or Spellings. But under Secretary Riley, I certainly, I would recommend to Secretary Cardona right now that there is urgency. There is urgency. When you read the book, you see a lot of solutions, and you're going to have another panel on solutions. But I think people's lives are being ruined financially even as we speak, even as these packages are being put together. And the Secretary has powers right now under current law. We don't have to wait for the Congress to act, to do this or to do that. There are powers I would recommend that the secretary send program review teams to selected colleges with instructions to look at how their enrollment management plans are actually operating. And depending on the results, if it is called for, because the institutions are not fulfilling their fiduciary duties under law to the purposes and mission of the Title IV programs, that
Title
he
IV
would,
being the federal student aid programs.
federal student, right, Title IV of the Higher Education Act, if they are not exercising their fiduciary duty, that he use his existing powers, the LS&T powers, called limitation, suspension, and termination. Now, what would a program review team look for? I would say there'd be like three things. One would be, is the enrollment management plan really undermining, through whatever techniques of financial aid leveraging or whatever, the purposes of Title IV? It would ask simple questions like, when the Congress increases, say, Pell Grants, we would expect that that might reduce the need to borrow. We have seen in numerous publications for decades the fact that grant aid has been going down and debt has been going up. And we assume that if we put more money into grants, borrowing will go down. Is that happening? A second question would be directly on Parent Plus. How is Parent Plus put into the package? Is it legal? Are there violations of existing law in the way Parent Plus is packaged? And I think the answer is yes, in many cases. I get cases still, many years after I have left the department, after I have concluded 12 years of litigation, from parents and students who say, no one else will help me. You seem to be the only one who's ever had any success in this. What can you do about it? And I look at their email exchanges from their institutions, and I am appalled, because the institutions are misrepresenting, seriously, they're deceiving parents. They're violating the multi-year promissory note, which is spelled out exactly as to how this is supposed to be. The third thing I would recommend the secretary charge the program review teams with would be, what is the effect of it on students by race, by income? And I think we know in the aggregate how that is going to turn out. Let's look at individual. Are they keeping track of this at all? The secretary has powers under LS&T authority in order to take action. I think that if those program review teams were sent out and the secretary was prepared to say, either you change your ways or we're going to terminate you from Title IV participation, you would see action in this area. As I say, those are things that could be taken. We don't have to wait for Congress to act.
Okay, thank you, John. Do we want to go to questions? So if you have any questions, now I'm going to give up my questioning and see if anybody else wants to have any questions for the panelists.
Thanks a lot. This was really informative. My name is Bob Massa, and I'm one of those guys who spent 43 of my 45 years in admissions, financial aid, and enrollment management in colleges that did not gap and that met full need. And the last 3 years after I came out of a failed attempt at retirement, I was at a college that did gap. And I think that's one of the greatest sins in higher education, frankly, especially if institutions are giving money to students who don't have need. But a couple of things. John, you mentioned that grants have gone down, and actually new data from the Brookings Institution that just came out shows, in fact, that grants have gone up, but so has price. So what they don't tell you is that the percentage of tuition that grants are paying has probably gone down, but the actual dollar amount in constant 2023 dollars has gone up since quite a bit since 06, 07. So just to clarify that. The other thing that I'd like to mention is that leveraging, and Don mentioned leveraging as one of the greatest sins, and I would agree with that, particularly for colleges that gap and that do not meet the needs of students who have financial need and instead pour money into non-need-based aid. But I think it's important for people to understand, and this is from my experience. So, you know, as I said, 43 of the 45 years have been spent in colleges that did not gap and met full need. I think my experience shows that leveraging for those institutions occurs primarily in the non-need area. And that is to say, okay, meeting full need, not with PLUS loans, not with unsubsidized loans, particularly now since the average loan or the maximum loan really hasn't increased in many, many years. Those institutions are not reducing aid to needy students in order to meet their need for enrollment leveraging on the non-need side. You could, of course, make the argument, and I would subscribe to this, that if they did not give aid to students with no need, that they could take that amount of money and increase the percentage and the numbers of low-income students. But the fact of the matter is, for most of those institutions, not the wealthiest, but for most of those institutions, they're using, and this is an argument that you all know, they're using that money to gain some tuition revenue in order to at least partially fund the needy students from students who might not otherwise enroll. So I think that's the reason behind it.
I definitely agree. I think that there are institutions that leverage only part of their aid, and that there are, some institutions that are able to redirect that money. I think what really alarms me are the enrollment management firms that are now advertising that you should use all of your aid. We can help you use all of your aid, leverage all of your aid. And once you get to that, then I think that it's part of the game plan really is to leave low-income students with gaps and to use the aid for colleges to get students who will help them raise their rankings and revenue. And that really is, I think, a big thing.
That was partly directed at me, and of course, yes, I'm referring to, for example, Pell Grants as a percentage of cost have been going down, right, and that is what I'm referring to.
Hi, I'm Michael Dannenberg with the Massachusetts Department of Higher Education. My question's for the panel as a whole. Is the enrollment management industry or specific firms accessories or an accessory to predatory lending, and if so, by the U.S. government, and if so, or other actors? And if so, what's the role of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau in addressing that? Thank you.
Could I try that?
I want you to.
I think the CFPB, the Department of Education, and the Department of Justice need to get on the same page. CFPB has a role to play here, no doubt about that. They have been very helpful in some litigation on these things. Yes, I think the enrollment management industry may be culpable. As I mentioned, perhaps didn't mention, they have a third-party servicers, which they are under the law, have a responsibility, a fiduciary responsibility. And if they are violating that, I think it's a violation of law. And whether that is the role of CFPB or whether the role of the Justice Department or the role of the Department of Education. I believe it's a terribly good question, and I would hope to see litigation on it.
John, I was wondering one other thing. Do you think that people in government actually know what enrollment management is or know about this industry?
Well, in my experience, I was thinking about, in all my communications with people on Capitol Hill, and Michael Dannenberg was a frequent person here. He's perhaps an exception. I can almost count on one hand the number of conversations I had over many years with people on the Hill about enrollment management. They are simply ignorant of it. I can remember specifically, perhaps, some in-depth conversations with, over the years, Clayton Spencer.
You don't have to name names.
Okay. And I could name a few others, but it'd be a very short list.
Sorry, Clayton. Go ahead.
Hi, my name's Aaron Alexander. I'm here because a friend is speaking, but I also have a student in high school who's going to be applying to colleges and anticipate approaching this maybe from the bottom up. You're talking about policy prescriptions that are going to take years to implement, I anticipate, and kudos to you because it's really important. I never heard of enrollment management until I saw this on Facebook and decided to come down to this. But as a parent who may be dealing with predatory lending practices, how would you advise approaching this and protecting oneself from this type of exploitation, or is there anything that you would recommend in terms of education? Is there an education system in place for students to protect yourself from this kind of industry?
John, I'm going to, Don.
Well, just keep in mind, I mean, you have lots of choices out there. Too often, students and their parents constrict their choices. They get in their head that there's only certain types of institutions that they want to apply to. There's a wide range, and I'm probably over the top on this, but Pasquarella and Terenzini, for about 20 years, about every 7 or 8 years, they would produce a meta-analysis of all the research on the outcomes of higher education. One of the things they say at the end, and this is pretty close to a direct quote, and because they also looked at outcomes related to subsequent career success and income and so forth. And remember, parents' income is the best predictor of income of their students' graduates. It's not the institution, it's parent income. They say, ultimately, it turns out it's far more important as to how students spend their time as to where they spend their time. In other words, where they go. So there are lots of options out there, and I think an informed parent can easily spot, very different schools. Some will offer you loans and some won't offer you loans at all. Just consider a range of choices.
Oh, did you have a? Yep.
Yeah, just briefly, I think your question exposes something really important and relevant to this conversation, is that there are no protections for you as a parent. There are net price calculators that universities are supposed to put on their website. Good luck finding them. They're probably out of date according to research by the University of Pennsylvania. They're several years old and they probably don't include the full cost of attendance. Your financial aid offer letter is purposely constructed to make sure that it's hard for you to compare one school to another. There are some resources that you can use, generally provided from outside the government by organizations like US Spire, and I might be New America that does the financial aid offer letter decoder, things like that. But you just need to keep your eyes open and read the fine print. To buy a product, I think a lot of consumers think is being honest with them. It isn't.
Before time's up, I want to make a point. Is this on? Okay. Keep in mind that the goals for enrollment management are set by presidents and trustees. That's where the goals come from. Now, this first part of what I'm going to say is speculative. The second part of what I'm going to say is firsthand knowledge. I lived it. The average tenure of a college president right now is 5.5 to 7 years. How do college presidents make their name? Building buildings, raising endowment, hiring faculty that go on to do great things, and or what happens with their enrollment profile. Those first 3 or 4 are a real crapshoot for a new. It takes college presidents a while to develop the relationships with donors. When you hire new faculty, you often don't know for a decade or more if they're going to go on and do those great things that you hired them to do. The only sure bet in 5.5 to 7 years is to change your enrollment profile. And as long as you're willing to spend money to do it, it can be done. I once thought that maybe trustees would care. I was kind of haunted by my experience that it took 3 or 4 years to get the care about gapping. I approached NACUBO about the idea of developing some kind of standard reports that NACUBO would bless as.
And NACUBO is the college business
Yes,
group.
so that the trustees ought to see every year related to how institutions spend their financial aid money. NACUBO did better than that. They went out and got money from the Robert Woodruff Johnson Foundation, where they created an interactive tool where you could go on and select 10 institutions. You couldn't actually see what those individual institutions were doing, but you would get information back on how they were spending their financial aid. My thought then, surely trustees will be bothered by lots of money being spent on non-need. That project died after 5 years because NACUBO said nobody used it. And I just keep thinking trustees say college and universities should be run like businesses, and maybe that explains
Did they
it.
actually see it as a tool that they could look at to figure out what their rivals were doing?
Well, I actually thought some smart enrollment managers could do that, but apparently even they didn't figure that out because it just got dropped because it just wasn't being used. Trustees weren't any more concerned than a lot of college presidents.
Okay. If nobody else has any other question, oh, we do have another question. Okay.
Hi, thank you so much. I'm Tanya Garcia. I'm with TICAS. And my question is a little bit wonky, but I think one of you mentioned about the National Student Loan Data System and the fact that race and ethnicity, has never been collected. Can you shed some light on maybe how that happened, why it wasn't a priority back then? States have been collecting race and ethnicity since the 70s and 80s, and I'm just curious why that never made its way into it. College Scorecard will have race ethnicity data soon, but we don't have that yet. And why do you think, how do you think that happened?
I did a paper in 2003 on that subject, looking for race by income. I had a big fight with NCES, National Center for Education Statistics. I said, I would like to see those data presented by race by income. And they would not do it. They said, if you over at NCER, where I worked at the time, want to do it, you can dig it out and publish it yourself, but we're not going to do it. And in my chapter, I believe I discussed that a little bit, that NCES said, oh, it's too granular, there may not be sample size, blah, 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 blah. I knew because I had been in the associations lobbying very hard for repression of these data over the years.
The college associations.
The colleges, right, and the college associations. So it was no surprise to me that never appeared. Now, my findings were not welcomed at the Department of Education. My the person in charge, Russ, at IES, said nobody's going to be interested in this. Let's not look into it.
Okay, well, thank you guys very much. I think we're probably ready for that second panel, right? Are we?
Yep, time for the second panel.
Time for the second panel. Thank you. Oh, and I just wanted to also thank Rachel for what she said, by the way, in the intro. Her work on financial aid award letters, and I mean her great work on financial aid award letters and PLUS loans are cited throughout the book, and she has made just great contributions. And I want to thank Samir for his comments today too. He has been just a great supporter, and I think has played an amazing role at TICAS. So thank you very much.
All right, we're just getting rearranged here. I am Zakiya Smith Ellis. I'm currently a principal at Education Council, but have spent time at the federal level in the Obama administration and at the state level in the state of New Jersey. And am thrilled to be here today on what seems like a wonky topic, but has a lot of implications for how colleges and universities are run and for the access that they provide to low and moderate income students, as we heard in the earlier panel. Excited to have Kevin Carey and Jerry Lucido here today to share with us some solutions. And I know if we're in DC, this close to the White House, we've got to be talking about policy solutions. And this set of chapters in the book does not disappoint when it comes to those solutions. Some of them have been talked about before, some of them maybe not in the way that you've heard before. So I'm really excited to get into the conversation. I want to start, though, for those of you who may not have had a chance to read the book in full yet, because it just came out. I'm just wondering if both of you, and we could start with Jerry and then maybe Kevin, if you could share about some of the solutions, or maybe the totality of the solutions that you propose in the book for a few minutes, just to give people a sense of what you proposed.
Sure. Thank you, Zakiya. And thank you, Steve, for inviting us all to be a part of this book and this effort. Let's take a half step back, and I promise to have a whole chapter on this, a complicated set of solutions, a three-part set of solutions, but I want to take a half step back first and say, if we care about the public interest, which is why we're here, and all the reasons higher ed should serve it, we need to understand that, as the book points out many times, that the results of higher education are disparate. Thank you. The results of oh, that's much better. Thank you. Hopefully I projected enough at the first part, that the results of higher education are disparate based upon socioeconomic status and frankly, many other vectors that relate to equity. And that, frankly, the incentives for higher education are misplaced. And so my thinking about the chapter and solutions come from that. And just to give you an example, we put together a team of researchers, and with great help and credit to Nick Hillman and his group at the University of Wisconsin, looked at a national data set of over 1,300 four-year colleges and universities. And let's think about public policy now and just for a moment. The national data set of 1,300 four-year colleges and universities, only 20% of them had both Pell enrollment of 25% and a Pell graduation rate of 60%. Think about that. 80% of the public colleges, public and private colleges four-year in the nation didn't meet one of those criteria or both. That's a frightening thought about our investment in these students and the commitment to get them through. So I wanted to start with that. So I think there's a couple antecedents to where we are. One, which is public policy over a couple of decades has moved higher education from a public good to a private good. You heard some of that from John and others. And that's a big issue because now, you know, you're expecting a system that is largely one paid for by private dollars with personal benefit to benefit the public, which that's, on the sense of it, not logical. You know, next, we have a positional marketplace in higher education. So the value of an individual institution is viewed by its position in the prestige hierarchy. So what do these incentives end up being? You know, so you have more of a market-based situation. So the incentives are misplaced because the incentives are on prestige, the incentives are on revenue in order to keep this all going. Because public investment has dropped and because we're in a highly competitive positional marketplace. So if you think about it, you know, we've heard, I think Don Hossler used the term iron triangle. You know, if you're not familiar with the iron triangle of enrollment management, it's typically depicted as an equilateral triangle. On one side is prestige or academic indicators. By the way, those could be changed and be much more equitable, by the way. But let me just leave that aside. On the other side of the equilateral triangle is revenue, because you need revenue to go. The third side of the iron triangle is equity indicators, diversity and the rest, right? But it's often depicted as an equilateral triangle. It is anything but an equilateral triangle because of the incentives. The incentives are for academic prestige and for revenue, right? So I think, so some of my solutions, Zakia, thank you for letting me go a half step back, you know, have to do with addressing that. And one of them is increased federal investment. I think you need two things. You need increased federal investment, increased state investment, increased public investment in order to get at those revenue goals to allow that triangle to be more equilateral than it currently is. And then I think you need to expect from colleges and universities, if not demand from colleges and universities, the results that you expect from an equity standpoint, from a societal standpoint, from what you need. And I think it takes it all. It takes both federal policy and it takes institutional commitments. I have a three-part plan to do that, but now I feel like I've used up my 5 minutes, so maybe I'll get a chance to talk about that in a little bit.
We'll come back to your three-part plan, but because we do want to hear it. Kevin, I'm going to ask, even if you have thoughts about the framing that Jerry offered, to hold on that, because I noticed some differences in your approaches that I would like to tease out, but would love for you to share your solution that you propose in the book.
Yeah, thanks, Zakia. Thanks, Jerry. Thanks, everyone, on behalf of New America for being part of this great discussion. My solution is federal price controls. So there we are. I'm just going to go right there. We can talk about how to do it, and there are different ways to do it. And I should say, I largely agree with Jerry, everything he said about the nature of the issue, the various competitive pressures that institutions are under, the unequilateral nature of the triangle. I think at least one of those is maybe just lip service, and the other is much bigger than the remaining one. So I think that's all right. My preference to go to what would be, you know, I think historically speaking, kind of a different, you know, maybe even an extreme set of solutions, but not necessarily a complicated one. And I think that's important. We can talk about this more during the discussion, but the way we think about solutions needs to flow from our analysis of how to locate higher education along the spectrum of institutions of public interest. There are lots of different kinds, and the right solutions depend on the type of institution. And I think part of the existing policy environment that has led to this discussion and the many, many deep and growing inequalities that you know, motivated Steve and his work in this book and all of us to be thinking about change, a lot of those kind of, I think, stem from some confusion, some of it deliberate, some of it not, about how to think about colleges and universities in a public solution context.
So I loved that your title was just federal price controls right away. And one of the things I appreciate about your writing is that you're so clear. You don't beat around the bush about what you're looking for. I would love, and maybe Jerry, you can use this opportunity to share a little bit more of the nuance of the three different strands. Essentially, you started with we need greater investment, and Kevin started with we need greater accountability for price, and very explicit accountability for price. Not like, oh, give me your plan for how you're going to be more affordable, but no, you need to do exactly this. And we could get into nuance of like, would those price controls be different by different type of institution, or would they, for those of you, again, who haven't read the book yet, it does talk about tiered, like a graduated scale. And for those of you who know me, I've been working in affordability for a number of years and don't think it ever described at work about price controls, but essentially suggesting that you have a graduated, transparent scale of pricing for students instead of what we do now, which is a mess, is a technical term. So I'm wondering how you all think about those different approaches, the focus on increased investment first, through aid to institutions versus focus on accountability primarily, without much mention to how much more money institutions should get for that.
Yeah, and I want to be clear, my preferred vision for price controls is one that very much has a lot of federal investment along with it. Our public higher education institutions, for the most part, are not like swimming in extra money. A few of them are. They're some of the biggest culprits that we're talking about today. But for the most part, it's a system that is internationally comparatively well financed, but a lot of these institutions have big issues with enrollment and facilities and the diversity of preparation of students that are entering, the diversity of kinds of students they have to serve, multiple missions. So we don't want to just take money away from them by saying, well, everything has to be the same, but you just can't charge as much. We should do what we've always done with our public higher education institutions. We're just doing less of it, which is to provide them with a stable source of public funding in exchange for providing an affordable price to everyone. And that, I think, is important to keep in mind. To me, the growing enrollment management problem is a function of the degradation of our national higher education policies. So we don't need to invent some new thing that we've never done before, or invoke some hypothetical socialist country in Europe and say, well, of course it can be done, they do it over there. We did it here. We just need to do it again. And my big point is that we can't rely on states to do it. There needs to be a stronger federal role. There already is a stronger federal role. The federal government has been playing this role of essentially backfilling the financing of the higher education system through student loans, and look where that's gotten us. So we need to do it. We're going to do it one way or the other. We just need to do it in a very different and more deliberate way.
Well, yeah, and I agree that the federal role needs to increase, and I agree with what Kevin just said. I have a slightly different approach to it, and my approach to it was twofold. One is, and this will be news to no one here, but that the Pell Grant has lost its buying power, and it needs to be restored. So doubling, even further than doubling, the Pell Grant really needs to be done, and to give students back that buying power. Now, the problem with the Pell Grant isn't that it provides money to students directly, and therefore the institutions can't do something else with that money. That's a good thing. The problem is that it doesn't compel institutions to admit those students or to serve them in ways that they're best served, and to actually move them forward. Pell graduation rates lag greatly behind other graduation rates, and in fact lag as a program less than 50%, and in community colleges about 30%, and in for-profit schools under 20%. This isn't good. So we need a companion program. I'm not arguing against Pell. I'm arguing for Pell because students need more buying power. Okay, but now I want to see a second program, a companion program that supports the institutions that take these students, and that the support would be a block grant to these institutions to both take more of them and to graduate more of them. As I mentioned before, we have a database that shows that only 20% of the institutions, both take 25% of their student body as Pell eligible students and graduate more than 60% of them. That's a serious problem. I think, however, we understand that if we could provide a stipend to institutions to both take and graduate them, and by the way, this tool can put institutions on a continuum, and we can understand who's doing well and who isn't, and we can provide goals and accountability for that from that money. So basically what I'm suggesting is additional public investment tied to institutional accountability and plans for progress that will move the needle.
So I want to, and I hope folks are thinking about, given the nature of who I see in the crowd and how detailed you all are in policy analysis, like good questions to probe on these and think about these ideas further. But as I was reading through, one of the things that didn't come up as much and that I've pondered a lot in the past several years is the issue of cost. And I don't mean price, to shout out to Bob Shireman, I mean cost of providing the education, not the price that we charge to students. And we often, one of my, I know this is being live streamed, and so I may get lambasted for this, but most hated statistics is about how the purchasing power has decreased, as if price and the tuition price that is charged is just a thing that we have to accept. Like, oh my goodness, yes, this is, so what is the actual cost to providing education, and what should that be? How has that changed over time? Is something that we almost never talk about. We just kind of take as a given that the tuition price is an accurate representation of all of the things that are needed to go to college. And I'm wondering how you both think about price, given that we know price, not just age strategies, which we talked about, and merit versus need, all of that, but the pricing strategy is also a strategy as part of this, and how you, Kevin, you pretty much get at this directly, but I'm wondering how you think about the actual cost and whether we've seen the same increase in cost of providing an education that needs to be there versus the price increases that we've seen in sticker price.
Well, I hope no one lambasts you, because you're right. We can't just take the denominator of the buying power of the Pell Grant for granted as if it is just something that has to be what it is. And you know, there's just a lot of commonly held and very deliberately communicated assumptions about the nature of higher education financing that underpin all of this that are, I think, essentially and purposely incorrect. I think the messages that colleges send to both their consumers and to policymakers is we don't want to charge any more than we have to, and we only charge as much as we need to provide the quality of education that we're here to provide. Okay. I mean,
is that not absolutely accurate?
It is not absolutely accurate. And again, this goes to trying to understand really what kinds of institutions we are talking about. And I think the difficulty is that in the universe of Title IV institutions that are subject to these solutions, we are almost on the entire continuum of purely public to purely private institutions. And so when I say purely public, I think of like the fire department or the K through 12 schools, right? We don't have price discussions about K through 12 schools. I know there are some folks who want us to. I hope we don't go down that road, but you know, so far we don't. So the policy question is, how much money do we give them, and how do we govern them and regulate them so they do a good job? Very hard questions to answer, by the way. I'm not saying it's simple to do that, but those are the questions we have. And then you think about purely private institutions, the government's role is almost entirely different. It's consumer protection and some kind of regulation. And then we find these institutions in the middle. We have public utilities, which have you know, monopoly characteristics that we have to govern in a certain way. And then we have institutions that are sort of so big and so important that we really need to protect consumers. And healthcare is like the obvious example, but that are fundamentally operating in a market where for-profit and, you know, nonprofit, sorry if my quote marks took my microphone away, you know, like allegedly nonprofit institutions that have an enormous amount of money and pricing power are competing with one another. And so the government really leans hard on quality, because you need a good college education in the same way that you need a good hospital. But it also provides a lot of subsidies, right? So that's the crucial thing. We're saying we both really want to make sure it's good, and we really want to make sure people can afford it. Only in higher education is Uncle Sam doing that and completely letting prices alone. right? We think about the healthcare debate. We are constantly talking about this push and pull between how we provide subsidies and how we regulate prices, and the idea that we would do the one and not the other is crazy, right? Like, we can look at prescription drugs. Look at how much more we pay for prescription drugs in the United States than everywhere else, because everywhere else regulates prices. So, sorry, that was like my long spiel about this. So we need to understand higher education institutions as particularly the ones that are most vulnerable to or apt to engage in these enrollment management practices as almost exactly in the most complicated middle of that continuum, right? Like public institutions, it's hard to do, but we know what to do. Private institutions, same way. Transparent regulations, fairly and cleanly enforced. With public and higher education institutions, we're kind of doing all of it at once. We're doing some subsidizing, we're doing some regulation, we're doing some governance. What we're not doing is controlling prices, right? And so without that, with no limit to what the number can be, it is in that expanse between certainty and anything, that is where enrollment management lives. All of these algorithms depend on being able to stretch that out for as far as you can go. And we can't rely on the collective goodwill of those institutions to somehow act in a way that is just directly counter to their own economic self-interest. No institutions behave that way. That is not a criticism of colleges in particular. That is just a statement of how organizations that exist in markets and have a strong desire to live and prosper will behave under certain kinds of circumstances. And so that's why I think we need to change this one thing.
Yeah, I'll take this in a slightly different direction. Not because I disagree, but because just to round out the discussion and our understanding of this. If there are college presidents either in the room or watching, and that's possibly unlikely, they would probably say, I'm not even charging tuition at the level of my cost. They would argue, look, I have to have grants and overhead to pay for my research buildings. I have to fundraise, which I used to have an academic position. Now all I do is fundraise, to fund this place. So so they often resist this whole discussion, and so that's why I'm saying we have to do something about the revenue side of it, on institutions. That said, let me add that there are some things that can be done with cost, and some enrollment management issues are part of it. And one of the issues I want to talk about is this hyper-competitive market we have that causes us to spend billions of dollars on marketing, that causes us to provide merit aid, or so-called merit aid, or discounts, if you will, or incentives to students who don't need the money to enroll. And this is inflationary, both things, because you're trying to constantly jump over each other. And so if you're at one position in the positional marketplace, you're always trying to get up to the next position because it makes you more attractive. You have to give less aid then to attract that student, because that's how the marketplace works. So we have to do something to tampen down this hyper-competitive situation. And that's going to require cooperation. And colleges and universities are loath to cooperate with one another because they're in a competitive marketplace. Yet at the same time, and someone in the first panel pointed out, they say, but I do things that are against my ethic because of it, that I don't like this. Well, let's change that. And how do we change that is a good question, but I think we have to start cooperating. And it does need to be a joint thing between the government, perhaps even the Department of Justice, and what colleges and universities and their associations do.
Yeah, a great philosopher, and I don't remember who this was, but said, don't hate the player, hate the game. And so let's talk about changing the game, changing the incentives is what essentially you're both talking about, right? Like, how do you change the incentive, and the entirety of the day is essentially how do you change the incentive structure, anyone in any place, although I know there's a lot of folks, a lot of times in faculty places will say, higher education is not a market. Kevin, you said several times, it's a market. Jerry, you said this is a market. It's not a market. This is academic institutions. And I'm wondering, can you speak to the incentive structure that you think is in place now and what we need to move it toward to get to a better place.
Do you want me to do that? Yeah. Well, I mentioned that incentive structure. So, let's think about what we might do with the current incentives. I think part of it is that we, we do need to rely on colleges and institutions and their leadership as leaders, and that's a real issue right now. Are we seeing public declarations of commitment to advancing equity? Are we really seeing that in everything that we do? I don't think we are, but I think we need to expect it. And I think we need to expect that with our, if you receive federal funds, this is what we expect, and that includes public and private institutions. I think this sort of, these equitable principles have to be put into place both publicly and in policy and in action. And when I'm talking about moving away from destructive competition, I'm talking about, frankly, solutions that maybe we've heard before, but we actually have to implement. Ending cooperations with publications that produce college rankings, frankly, with almost all higher education recognized as misleading and false. Rolling back non-need-based merit aid in favor of supporting low and middle income students who most need institutional support. Ending the practice of the financial leveraging we just heard about. Closing loopholes for donors, alumni, and influencers who are already heavily advantaged in the admission process. Frankly, even fighting for an antitrust exemption in certain ways so that we can talk about how we do this together and roll back some things that make sense. Kevin talked about price controls, and I think, and I'm not talking about collusion on price. I'm talking about understanding how we can maybe cooperatively work to do some of these things like roll back merit aid and reduce the competition that we're in that is actually destructive to educational results, that kind of thing.
Are those the kind of incentives that you think we need as well, Kevin?
I guess I'm trying to be realistic about what good public policy design can do. And I'm wary of systems that are extremely complicated. They tend to kind of collapse under various kinds of pressures. And I want to be realistic about how colleges and universities are likely to behave in different sets of circumstances. Obviously college is a market, so I think when people say it's not, what they really mean is it shouldn't be seen as only a certain kind of narrow consumer good, which I completely agree with. That's why we provide colleges with protection and subsidy and esteem and hold them up in our culture in certain ways. That all needs to be reinforced and improved, and so no debate there. Or they're making a version of the argument we're making here, which is that it's become too much of a market and should become less so. And I agree with that as well. This is a word that is used a lot in ways that annoy me sometimes, but really the transformation of our higher education system from publicly subsidized and affordable to everyone to this is like neoliberalism in the worst possible way. Right? It just is, right? Everything you read about, this is just not a huge multi-decade error in the way that we've approached public policy that we need to start moving back in the other direction. I kind of go back to the point that there is a way to do this. It is a very simple bargain of public subsidies in exchange for stable, clear prices. We can't rely on states to do it. They are essentially a version of market actors in this, in a way, right? They're competing for tax rates and subsidies and politics and all this stuff. They just are not reliable partners in the way that they need to be. They also are the people who are sort of swallowing up the loan money and swallowing up the subsidies just through their tax and finance system. The version of price controls that I would offer is actually in some ways a combination of a free college program and a Title I for higher education. I would offer essentially a standard subsidy to institutions that agree to a certain affordable price schedule. If that subsidy is more than the revenue they lose, they keep it. And they can use it to invest in infrastructure. They can use it to invest in faculty. They can use it to invest in quality, because we need that too. But you don't actually need two separate systems when you do it that way. You can just kind of have one, which is pretty straightforward. I am just inherently wary of any plan that requires sort of collective action in a field that in many ways is most characterized by independence, in a way that we all, I think, celebrate and see the virtues of, right? I mean, we are a huge country. We're a very wealthy country. There's just there's never been any country like this one in terms of how many colleges and universities we have, how different they are, how diverse they are, how they're all out there trying to be good at what they are. That has been enormously to the benefit of the United States. I don't want to lose that. But then we need to take that for granted. That is part of our culture. That's part of something we want to preserve. But if we preserve that independence, we have limited options that rely on some kind of collective action that is outside of everybody's independent best interests.
Yeah. I want to give a short story, very short, of when I was in New Jersey. I may have shared this with Kevin before, but we were trying to do an affordability thing at the state level, notwithstanding all of the issues with state, but we wanted to have, free, we already had rolled out free community college for low-income students, and we were trying to figure out how to do this for your public institutions as well, to have some kind of free program for students that went to not just community colleges, but all the public institutions. And I, naively thought going in that there would be many college presidents who would be so excited because we were talking about additional investment and so that their students could have a more affordable pathway. Like, isn't that a win-win? But what I heard from one college president who I think was representative of what others just were unwilling to say in a public forum, when I asked, like, well, what is the amount of increased resource that you would need in order to agree to just, and this was just for like low-income students, in the state, to offer this for that number of students. And he said, there is no amount of money that you could give us for us to make a commitment to, and because we were also talking about holding prices steady for others. So we said, like, for low-income students, this, for, moderate income students, this, and then for all students, could you at least, not lower your prices, but just like not increase them for like maybe a year? It's like, no, because we would be giving up the ability to increase tuition in a state that was unregulated. Like, and in the long term, we would rather have the ability to charge as much as we would like than be reliant on the government for some subsidy, because we can't rely on the government for unlimited amounts of subsidy. But theoretically, in our mind, we could get as much as we could possibly get through tuition. And even though I don't think that's realistic in terms of what you actually can get from tuition, the idea that there was an unwillingness to even try to strike a bargain, I think speaks to some of the political realities that I'd like to get into with you all. You speak to some of this in your chapters about who the likely opponents might be of these kinds of proposals, and I'm curious about that, not necessarily that story in particular, although you're welcome to comment on it, but the idea of like who the likely or unlikely opponents and supporters of these proposals might be.
Yeah, I think we have to, there's just a basic distinction between policies that are student-focused and policies that are institution-focused. I talk about this a little bit in the chapter, but I think the debate and the dialogue around the America's College Promise program that was proposed, very seriously a few years ago before it ultimately fell short, was really instructive. Here was a program, this was the Biden administration's, with members of Congress proposal for essentially free community college. So one, community college is all the way over on the left of that spectrum I was talking about, right? They're the higher education institutions that are the most like purely public institutions. They have a local constituency, they're not competing in a national market, they're not expected to be out there marketing themselves with like football teams and stuff. They generally still have low prices. It varies, but still low prices, and more of a public mission kind of flowing out of the K-12 system. And yet, it wasn't as if even that subsection of the higher education community that was going to receive all these subsidies was full bore in favor of every aspect of ACP, because ultimately that money was for the students and not the institutions. The students and not the institutions. Those are two different constituencies with two different sets of needs. And overwhelmingly, the political dialogue in America about higher education is being driven by student needs, particularly around the student loan crisis and this overwhelming sense of affordability. Student and their parents and their families, right? And so all of the energy that is motivating policy change is coming from the students and the parents, because they're the ones who vote, right? They're the ones who have political power. But the parts of the system that actually have influence in terms of how policy made, not the students, it's the institutions. It's the institutions at the state level, whether they're in a back room talking to, someone who's working for the governor, or, somewhere else probably, after they left and they went and talked to someone, their legislature, I know how it works, right? They're doing this thing, we don't like it. We're against this whole thing. The governor's office is up to no good. I used to work for a state legislature, and I worked for the state senator from a public university, so I heard these things all the time. And the same thing here in Washington, D.C., right? In addition to some, I don't know about this on the community college side, no one outside the community colleges wanted ACP because they don't want that precedent to be set. They don't want price controls because they don't want to be affordable. They won't say this in public, but they don't want to be affordable. The business everyone wants to be in is selling expensive things to rich people, right? Like, biggest business in the world is the French company that owns all the nice handbags. Like, literally the richest person on earth is the guy who owns that company because it's enormously profitable and there's a huge amount of social status that goes along with it. So you get the two things that like all human beings want at once, status and money together. That is what people are shooting for. And the problem, enrollment management gives them the promise that they can get there, right? They're like, yeah, we can help you, right? There's free money out there. If you can just optimize the algorithm the right way and have a better marketing strategy, we're gonna get you to the right people. And like, it works sometimes temporarily for some people, but it is a disaster if everyone does it all at once. And it's going to get worse as there are fewer students, as we all know, kind of coming in out of high schools, going forward, as we've essentially wrung all the efficiency out of the system by maximizing price discrimination all the way down the demand curve. There's not any money left. All those little colleges that are going bankrupt like once a week, they all had enrollment management consultants. They were all trying to do their thing. It didn't work for them. And so we need to like not let that happen again to our public institutions, which serve many more students and are much more vulnerable and more important.
Let me return to what I told you earlier. I tried to walk both sides of this in my solution. One was the student end by increasing the Pell Grant and giving students more buying power. The other was to provide institutional block grants, and with an expectation, however, of accountability on your progress toward a specific set of students, and that is those low-income students who qualify for Pell, the low and low-middle-income students, and in fact, allowing the institutions to, because those students tend to be more expensive very often to serve. They have different needs. They require different things on campus, and the institutions don't have those dollars, or they don't devote those dollars. But if those dollars were provided in a certain amount, and there's some research around 1,000 to 1,500 per student, something like that, that could move the needle on this. You would then have both players, students on one side, institutions on the other, benefiting from public policy. The one thing I don't want to let up on, though, and I know you spoke against it, and cooperation does seem Pollyannish, right, in this world. I write that, and I admit that without shame at all. But I still expect it. And the reason that I expect it is it's the right thing to do. And colleges and universities know it's the right thing to do. And so what we want to compete on isn't our ranking in U.S. News or any other ranking. It isn't on those prestige indicators. It's on the results of what we produce. It's on our educational results. And just to use a silly analogy, we have cooperation in the National Football League, right? And we allow that through an exemption from antitrust. That allow a small market team in Cleveland or Indianapolis to compete with a big market team in New York or Los Angeles because why? They share certain things. They share revenue. They have price controls on their rosters. And that allows allows those teams to compete on the field for points. I think we need to have a similar way of thinking about how we compete in higher education for educational results that benefit the nation. That's my argument for it.
I love that. Are we close to getting to audience questions, or I want to just put in our minds one thing. I think that's a great place to end on. How do we have people competing on the things that we care about? And the reminder that big business, I think of NFL as big business, can have clear regulatory structures that they operate around and still have what I think is probably one of the most competitive, we can debate football in general, but like most competitive things that you can think about, which is like American football. You can't think of like many things more brutally competitive than that, and work within a system that. So I appreciate that piece for us, but I feel like it requires a cultural mindset shift, because, you know, to the person that was mentioning, you know, their child's about to go, everybody like wants the good deal, essentially. Like when you're talking to, you know, neighbors or colleagues, like, oh, you know, this happened when I was at my very first job, was college counseling low-income students, and even them, they would say, oh, the tuition of this college is $50,000, or, you know, all in $50,000 might have been for this private institution. And they're comparing it to like, well, you've got your local public regional here, and the tuition is $20,000, tuition, room and board, full fees, full cost of attendance, right? And the private college, yes, they gave you a $10,000 scholarship, which makes you feel great because it's called something great. It's like some hometown hero named scholarship. And so now you still have to pay $40,000. Unfortunately, there's not that much money for the public college, but it only cost $20,000, so you're still winning, but you didn't get the scholarship. And like, even for the low-income students, that was part of the psychology. I buy into this myself. Like, I go to the outlets once a year, every year, and I go to a handbag store where probably all these handbags are still made in China at the same place that they make them at Target, right? Like, that they sell them at Target, but they are 75% off, okay? And when I see that there's a $500 handbag and I'm getting it for 75% off, I'm making out. Like, I could have just gone to Target, like, right, and not gone out to the outlets and just got the same handbag, but it makes me feel so good. So I want us to think about, like, how do we recognize the psychology aspect of this, the human psychology aspect of this, and change the incentives for the system, but also for individuals as well. That's my moderator prayer. Let's go to audience questions, or online questions even.
Yeah, we have a question from online. How does the looming enrollment cliff affect the way that colleges engage with enrollment management? Do you see this as a challenge for changing practice?
The enrollment cliff will make every single problem we've discussed here today much worse. No doubt. You know, if you talk about what is going to motivate institutions to do more of this, that's what will. People, you know, again, they don't really come to these practices because it's what they dreamt of when they went into a career in academic administration. It's just what has kind of been thrust upon them by circumstances and responsibilities to provide for the financial well-being of their institutions. As long as there were, you know, robust public funds and enough students to, you know, kind of fill up the dorms, you know, that was one kind of job. When there aren't, it becomes a very different kind of job. When you're looking for solutions, you're going to talk to the person who says they have them. And that is literally the business of enrollment management, is saying, I understand you, I understand your institution, I understand your problem, and if you pay me, I will help you and it will all work out better. And so, yeah, it is one of the biggest reasons for us to get on top of this now, because otherwise it will get worse.
I think it's a great question. I think whoever sent it in, I completely agree with what you just heard. And there's more than just the enrollment cliff. It's who those students are going to be. And those students are going to be lower in income than the students we've had in the past, and more diverse, and haven't participated in higher education as often as those we're currently serving. And so it doubles down even on what you just heard in terms of our need as a nation to do something different.
And I would say I hear often about the enrollment cliff, and some folks aren't aware that when you disaggregate right now, we've already lost 200,000 black students in the past 20 years. We have 200,000 fewer black students in higher education enrolled now than we did 20 years ago. It actually might be higher than that, but it's a lot. And so the enrollment cliff has already, it's not just a cliff because of age, it's actually because of a lot of other things, but there's a huge enrollment decline that we're already seeing in some subgroups. Are there others online? Okay, we can, yeah. I think they want you to do this so that people online can hear the question as well.
Kevin, have you thought about how price controls only in the public sector, what kind of disequilibrium would create then with what's going on in the private sector and what kind of problems that might create?
Yeah, I would actually not limit it to the public sector. I would offer it to anyone who wants to take the deal. So again, what I'm thinking about is a voluntary system where the federal government essentially offers a bargain of a certain new operating subsidy in exchange for adopting a clear, consistent set of prices, along with some accountability, because I think we should have that too. And if there are private nonprofit institutions that want to participate in that, I'm all for it. And again, I think it points out that a lot of our private institutions are not wealthy at all. They actually charge less than some public institutions. Their student profile has a larger percentage of first generation and lower income students. So you can actually make the numbers add up for a non-trivial number of private institutions. So I would make them eligible as well.
Yeah, thank you. Bob Massa again. Just a quick question. A number of possible solutions here that you both talked about. One that I'm interested in terms of your take is, and it's not a panacea, but what if institutional eligibility for federal financial aid were tied to the percentage of institutional grant, both in the private and the public institutions, that went toward financial need rather than toward no need, and you could set that anywhere you want, like 95% of your institutional grant money, funded or unfunded, would go to need-based financial aid and 5% would go to merit, or something along those lines. What do you think of that?
I mean, I think I support the spirit of what you're saying, but then I think about, like, what if it was actually the Department of Education's job to enforce those regulations? And then it gets really complicated. And any kind of regulatory regime needs a system of clear, stable, and enforceable definitions. And definitions around money are hard because money is fungible, right? And so right away, when we say there's two kinds of aid, and one is merit-based and one is need-based, I actually think a lot of the aid is neither of those things. I think a lot of those aid is just like a residual of the enrollment management regime. It's not for either thing. It's just like recruitment aid. It's a price setting mechanism. I mean, all you have to do is just like sit down with any family that's applying to college now and look at the award letters that they're getting back, and you will see, a financial aid package that includes $15,000 presidential merit scholarship. Is that merit aid? No. They actually did no measure of the merit at all. It's just a discount off the price. So it sounds very hard to enforce, and I'm in favor of policies that are as simple as possible and that can be enforced in a way that has fidelity and will work, and I'm not sure that would work.
Yeah, I mean, the question there, for me anyway, is not merit versus need. It's need versus no need. I don't care what you call it.
Can I just offer, though, I don't care if you offer need-based aid or if you offer zero tuition, and I actually think that for low-income students, it's more helpful not to offer generous scholarships, but just to tell them what price they will pay. And so this whole game that we have, I'm like moderator pride, this whole game that we have bought into of high tuition, high aid is part of the problem. What am I going to pay? What am I going to pay? What am I going to pay? And at some colleges, almost everybody has need, because your definition of need is or because frankly, your tuition is so freaking high, which is why I get to this point of it. If your tuition is, my alma mater, Vanderbilt, was in the news for having one subspecialty of $100,000 total cost of attendance. At that price, who the hell is not eligible for need-based aid, right? Who has $100,000 a year to pay out of pocket? And I don't know, somebody that's still making $250,000 and you're gonna say, yeah, I gave them some aid and that is my need-based aid. I'm just like, Like, let's take a step back and let's figure out, like, what is our first principle here? Our first principle is you don't enroll enough low-income students, so you need to have more. And those low-income students that you do enroll, they don't need to be gapped in their financial aid. I would get into, like, what even is gapping and what are we saying the EFC is, and is that even reasonable? But that would take us down a whole nother path. So, like, what am I going to pay? Is that a reasonable percentage of my income? And not get into all the various definitions would be my vote. You want to say one thing before we have one more question?
No, I just want to get back at, I mean, Kevin mentioned it, it's the public policy issue is, how do you make, how do you measure all of this stuff? How do you, it gets so complicated. And that's why I keep focusing on, we have certain objectives that we have to meet. We want to see more low-income and low-middle-income students in college, and we want to see more of them succeed. So I want to focus the metrics on those two things, and say, do that. I don't care how you do that. But that's what our expectation is if you're going to receive these subsidies. To me, that's one of the things I'm thinking about.
Thank you.
So putting aside the antitrust case that's quietly been opened at Justice at hearing somebody in higher ed mention the word cooperation, one of the things that is increasingly challenging for college students is are non-tuition expenses, and that is, it's not the only driver, but it's part of the driver of some of the challenges we're seeing in increased loan debt, et cetera. And part of that is the result of massive cost of living increases, a very weak social safety net in the United States, and increasingly a lot of pressure on institutions to sometimes operate as educational institutions and as social service providers. So I'm curious what each of you think of how much can colleges, price controls on tuition, things like that, and higher ed in general deal with some of these challenges alone, given that now for a lot of students, more than half of their expenses come from non-tuition, and that portion continues to grow dramatically.
Yeah, I mean, I think ultimately what I'd like to do is make the Pell Grant for that and not for tuition over time, right? Like, I think there's been a really positive growth of awareness of the complex financial lives of our college students, and I'd like to think that we are now, as a community in a field, like well past the idea that as long as the tuition is reasonable, we've done our jobs and they'll be fine, because we know that that's not true at all. And of course, if we think about, it's always important as we think about things like prices outside of higher education, particularly around inflation, to be aware of what specifically we mean when we say that inflation is up. And what we mean is that people are paying more money for rent, they're paying more money for food, basically all the things that students spend their money on, not other things. And so that feels like the big macro transition to make. We have a structure that makes the price affordable, and then we support people with grants based on their economic circumstances.
Such a complicated question you ask, let me just add mental health to the rest of that you mentioned, which we can't hire enough counselors at colleges and universities right now. It's a huge additional cost, and so I think about that addition. I mean, this doesn't just happen in higher ed, as you said. It has to happen across other aspects of society, so that's one of the things I wanted to mention. And the other one just slipped away. I apologize. I'll come back to it if I can think of it.
All right. I know that there's a lot of work, and you've done a lot of this work, and our friends at TICAS have done a lot of this work to think about basic needs supports and how other programs can support college students. And so to the point that Kevin just raised, that this is an issue for low and moderate and middle income families across America, I would just make an urge and a plea. I think sometimes people in higher ed policy can think of themselves as, I care about what happens to students who are in college, but this is a plea to say, you should care about, social service programs more broadly, and you should, think about how those programs interact with, make students who are enrolled in higher education eligible or not eligible. Like, that has a big impact on students who are in college and their ability to meet those costs. Is there one more?
Yeah, we have another question from online. Will an increase in closures and mergers among public institutions change their enrollment management practices? And if so, how?
I mean, I think it also just creates a broader environment of urgency and anxiety among institutions who, I'm assuming as a baseline, don't want to close or merge. That is something that only happens because of exigency. We're not making any mergers from strength. Mergers are always proposed as we got to do something. We don't want to shut these places down. They're always very politically fraught. There are always a lot of class and race dynamics when it comes to these mergers. Like, it is often the institutions with the least social capital in the state political system that get targeted for, maybe we can just merge you. And so I think that is going to, as with the enrollment cliff, just push people quicker towards some other solution that they can find. And I want to say to the point that Zakiya made about her dialogue with the other institutions, it's not irrational for people who run public higher education institutions to not have a great deal of trust in the state to have their best interests, right? I mean, so we should understand that. Our colleges and universities have been used as a fiscal balancing wheel in more or less every recession going back to the 1950s. So we always go to the well to avoid hard choices. It happened the worst in our last Great Recession, and I'm sure people rationally think it could happen again. Which is why they want to retain control over where their money comes from. It's why enrollment management offers them the promise of that control, right? Like, you don't have to march to the state capitol for your money. We can find it for you in the market, but with a lot of problems, as we found.
Okay, one last question, because I know we're over time.
Hi there. This has been a really great discussion. And as I listen to you all speak about the different actors who have concerns in this, whether it's parents or students or the universities, it's been really interesting to hear how we talk about the educational institutions, not by the individuals who comprise the administration, right? So even when we talk about cooperation and what that would look like, it feels, the reason why it feels Pollyanna-ish is because it's requiring us to change the philosophical underpinnings of the United States of America, right? We are a very individualistic country, and the way that we view education, especially higher education, is rooted in certain people should have access to this. So, taking all of that in, how can we help people to understand the benefits of what it means to have, lower income and diverse students in these institutions? Like, why would someone who isn't in this room care about this, right? Like, I think, I have a very personal stake in it as a Black woman, But if you don't identify in any way of being a low income or a person of color or lower socioeconomic status, whatever, how do we make it so that other people can care, especially because of our country's structure?
I'd like to tackle that a little bit just by a concept that Marta Tienda, a sociologist at Princeton, talked about, and she talked about yielding a demographic dividend as opposed to looking at the demographics and the cliff as a deficit. Let's look at what we can gain by educating a broader swath of America, by having our leaders be from all walks of life, what about our economic system, our political system, our healthcare systems? What about a healthier public society? And so, we have to think about that. And there have been times in our history that we know about, with the Morrill Act and the Land Grant Act and the GI Bill and later on even the Higher Ed Act, and that said, okay, this is a public good. And we probably are at that time again, is what I'm suggesting, and that we ought to try to yield the demographic dividends. Thinking like that, I think, gets at it.
Yeah, it's a complex thing for institutions. It's a great opportunity in many, many ways, right? We know an awful lot about the benefits of diversity for how organizations function, how they think, how they produce, how they grow. I really believe that we have the opportunity for just better higher education institutions all around as the nation itself becomes more diverse and I hope more equitable over time. It's matching that up with the like very short-term needs that university administrators feel. So I was having a conversation with the president of a small private college in Pennsylvania about all these issues. Pennsylvania is kind of like ground zero for enrollment problems. It's sort of the enrollment cliff has already happened there. And as people have talked about, you really have to understand the racial ethnic breakdown of where these changes in like birth rates and number of people are happening. And it is, like more among white families, more among college-educated families, more among families in the Northeast. And Pennsylvania is all three of those things put together. So I said, well, shouldn't your enrollment strategy be recruiting more diverse students? Because that's where the students are. And he said, absolutely, that's what we want. We would love to have them, but like we're in rural Pennsylvania and those students kind of don't want to be here. Because there's like us and we're great, and then you go 2 blocks outside the campus and there's a lot going on around us that feels hostile to those students. And he's like, I understand why. So I think this is also an opportunity for colleges and universities to get outside their walls, right? Out into their communities and be more proactive actors in having ideas and opinions about the kind of, not just the kind of institution they want to be, but the kind of community they want to live in. Because if that community isn't also a partner in becoming more diverse, they won't be able to.
Thank you. Thank you. I feel like we're probably at time, spent a little bit over time, and thank you all for staying with us if you have for this extra amount of time. Thank you both of you for your ideas in the book and for your contributions today, and I will wrap it up here. Okay.